The first signs were not spoken aloud. In the early hours of August, the 21st, year 1915, a brittle wind swept across the dry ridges above Suvla Bay. British command had by then been strangled by heat, miscommunication, and Ottoman gunfire for over 4 months. But that morning, before the sun could fully lift the curtain of mist clinging to the hills, a silent unease had already settled within the camp of the Sandringham Company, men of the 5th Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment. They were not yet ghosts. They smoked rolled tobacco under canvas lean-tos, adjusted their puttees in silence, and wrote letters to sisters and wives. Private George Archer, a railway porter from King's Lynn, counted only 15 words on the crumpled page in front of him, struck again by the sense that he had nothing left to say. War had a way of flattening the soul. But something else lingered that morning. Not fear, not even resignation. It was something more primitive, a kind of pressure behind the eyes, a hollowness in the stomach. And the strange light that broke over the ridge wasn't morning. It was pale and colorless, not quite white, not gray, just wrong. The Sandringham Company was to advance across the ridge of Anafata. Orders had been dispatched in handwriting so sloppy it could scarcely be deciphered. Captain Edward Bolingbroke, son of a clergyman and decorated twice for discipline, read them 3 times and still found them contradictory. They were to press into Ottoman lines with haste, then in the same breath to avoid overextension beyond battalion flanks. By 7, the men had risen. The mist had thickened. It rolled down from the inland hills, not sea-born, but born of something else, clinging and high as a man's shoulders. At 7:20, Bolingbroke blew his whistle, and the men disappeared into it. 2 Turkish officers, later interrogated by the War Office, gave sworn statements. One, Lieutenant Kamal Saifi, said he had watched the English company march in loose formation toward the high ridge. Then, as if they had walked into a fold of the earth itself, they were gone. No gunfire, no shouting. The mist simply swallowed them. Saifi swore by the Quran that no shot was fired by Ottoman rifles in that 10-minute window. The official record, such as it is, claims the men were lost in intense resistance, but the reports are riddled with contradictions. Only 32 bodies were ever recovered. None of them bore wounds consistent with heavy gunfire or shrapnel. Most, said the field medics, were as if they had simply fallen asleep. By the end of the day, the sun had burnt through the mist, and silence returned to the ridgeline. No survivors, no footprints in the hardened soil. Nothing remained but the impression of their path through the grass, and a pocket watch stopped at 7:41. 2 days later, a war correspondent named Lawrence Henry Axton, traveling with a detachment of engineers, returned to the site. His journal, now held at the British Library, but unpublished during his lifetime, records a disturbing observation. He described the ground where the regiment had vanished as abnormally dry in defiance of the prevailing humidity. There were no insects, no birds overhead. He wrote of a dead silence, like the air had been sucked out. He did not stay long. In Norfolk, rumors began within weeks. The company had not simply died. They had vanished. Mothers wrote to regimental offices. Sisters petitioned the War Office for the return of effects. There were none. Not a single item had been retrieved beyond the 32 corpses, which themselves were left unclaimed in shallow graves until 1921, when an exhumation team arrived. At that time, the skull of Captain Bolingbroke was identified not by military dental records, those did not exist, but by an unusual silver crown on his upper right molar. The remainder of the skeleton had been scorched, though there were no signs of surrounding fire damage. The exhumation report classified the cause of death as undetermined, possibly natural exposure. His boots were still laced, uniform intact. What followed in London was a furious silencing campaign. Reports to newspapers were redacted or buried. The Daily Chronicle, which had planned to run a series of columns on the Sandringham mystery, was allegedly visited by agents of the War Office and told, in no uncertain terms, to refrain. National morale, the editor noted in a private letter, is best preserved without tales of vanishing regiments. But not everyone stayed quiet. Reverend Marcus Harrow, chaplain to the Norfolk families, conducted interviews with 7 relatives who claimed to have received strange letters in the weeks before the disappearance. Letters marked by erratic handwriting, obsessive references to dreams of lightless fog, and a calling from the earth. One widow, Mrs. Clara Hensley, showed Harrow a torn envelope from her brother. The postmark was dated 3 days after the known date of the company's disappearance. The letter, unsigned, read only, "We have passed through something. I fear we are not meant to return." The authenticity of this letter remains contested. It was never introduced as evidence, and Hensley later suffered what was then termed nervous collapse and was confined to a home for women of distress. Her story, however, remains preserved in Harrow's private notebook, recovered in a dusty attic in Norwich decades later. In the months that followed, a second wave of reports emerged, stranger and more difficult to dismiss. Turkish soldiers, bivouacked in the same hills that winter, reported seeing figures standing motionless in the mist at dawn. Not silhouettes, not mirages, men in British uniform. They never moved. When approached, the mist thickened and the figures disappeared. One account, logged by an Ottoman quartermaster, describes a night watchman who shot at one such figure, only to find the bullet buried in a tree trunk 20 meters away, as though it had passed clean through air. To this day, in the military archives in Kew, a file sits marked GR 515, ANA, Irregular Losses. It contains exactly 33 pages. 5 of them are missing. The Court of Inquiry convened on the 7th of October, year 1915. It was not held in Whitehall, nor in any proper courtroom, but inside a converted grain warehouse near the port of Thessaloniki. The floor still bore the marks of transport crates and Turkish blood. Rain battered the roof. Outside, the Greek dock workers moved like ghosts among unloaded medical stretchers and barrels of cordite. Major Lionel Ashcroft, recently promoted and reluctantly assigned to the matter, arrived with 2 trunks of files and no expectations. He had served in Egypt before the war, and though he was no stranger to desert hallucinations or battle confusion, the loss of over 100 men without a single clear eyewitness troubled him more than he let on. The transcripts of field radio communications were inconsistent. 3 signalers stationed at Hill 17 recorded nothing. 2 claimed interference, not static, but a humming that rose in pitch until the receiver failed. Ashcroft's first task was to re-interview surviving officers of nearby battalions. Most were still recovering from wounds, half-starved and deeply resentful of what they saw as scapegoating. The interviews were conducted in a stifling, candle-lit back room, with scribes transcribing every word in blotchy ink. Captain Hugh Marston of the Essex Regiment was the first to speak plainly. He stated that at exactly 7:35 on the morning of August 21st, he observed an isolated cloud that hung over the ridge where the Sandringham Company had last been seen. The cloud was opaque, faintly shimmering, shaped more like a curtain than vapor. Marston had no further explanation, but insisted it did not drift with the wind. It held position, and then, in the span of what he guessed was 4 minutes, it vanished. Next was Sergeant George Bell from the Yorkshire Engineers. Bell had manned a signal post roughly 600 yards east of the position. He reported something even more unsettling. According to his statement, as the cloud settled, his field glasses, properly maintained and regularly calibrated, refused to focus. He described a shimmering at the edges, as if heat waves rose from stone, but the air was cool. When asked if he observed any enemy movements, Bell said only this: "No Ottomans, no sound, just the silence, like before a thunderclap that never comes." Major Ashcroft added a personal note in the margins. "Bell shows no sign of embellishment. I believe him frightened, but not delusional." The testimony of Lieutenant Arthur Spencer, a young officer of 19 with hollow eyes and blackened fingers from trench rot, introduced a new and disturbing element. He claimed that 2 days prior to the disappearance, a private from his platoon had wandered into the fog while on latrine duty and did not return. The fog, Spencer said, was so thick it took the sound of his boots away. They found the man, or what remained of him, later that day at the foot of a ravine. His uniform was dry, his face was untouched, but every bone in his right arm had been shattered, crushed inward like paper. No shelling had occurred in that sector for 48 hours. Spencer's commanding officer had ordered silence. No point upsetting the rest, he was told. Accidents happen. Spencer held his mouth shut until the hearing, but his eyes betrayed the toll. Ashcroft did not push further. He did not need to. The inquiry reached a stalemate. The surviving documentation was patchwork at best. No maps clearly marked the exact path the Sandringham Company had taken. No photographs existed of the ridge at the hour of their disappearance. The fog that morning, recorded only by a handful of officers, had left no trace. Ashcroft sent a request to review aerial reconnaissance logs from the Royal Flying Corps, hoping for some vantage from the air. He received only a terse reply. Weather conditions obscured view. No usable images collected on August 21st, yet rumors persisted. The Greeks who worked the docks near the supply lines spoke of the devouring white. They claimed a hill sacred to their ancestors had once stood near the ridgeline, and that the land itself punished the walking of soldiers upon it. One older woman, never officially interviewed, was overheard telling a cook that the land has teeth and it does not let go. These comments were dismissed as local superstition, until one morning when a dispatch rider named Corporal Timothy Bragg failed to return from a routine delivery run to the outer trenches. The weather was clear, the terrain open, no hostiles reported. When his horse returned without him, saddle stained in blood but unmarked by shrapnel, another rider was sent out. That man returned shaking. He reported finding the corporal's satchel hanging from a tree limb. No signs of a body. Just a rusted compass lying below, its needles spinning without rest. At this point, Ashcroft began to suspect something beyond coincidence. He sent a direct appeal to the War Office for a full scientific team to be sent. The reply was swift and cold. Withdraw from matter. No further inquiry authorized. Assets reassigned. Ashcroft was placed on leave within the week. He spent the remainder of the war in a desk position in Marseille. He never spoke of Gallipoli again, but in the back of his personal journal, found years later in a box of old field papers, was a sketch, a crude drawing of the ridgeline. It bore a single word written beneath it in block letters: threshold. The year turned. Winter came late to the Dardanelles, but it came with a cold that stiffened the rifles and blackened the toes of men who had already lost all reason for fear. By January of 1916, the Gallipoli campaign had been deemed a failure in all but name. Evacuation orders were prepared in secrecy, and whispers filled the ranks. Yet in one narrow office of the British Intelligence Corps in Alexandria, the matter of the Sandringham disappearance remained open, if only unofficially. It was Lieutenant Commander William Forsyth, a naval man by origin, who took up the file without orders. Known for his meticulous handwriting and habit of sniffing paper before reading it, Forsyth had served in Persia and knew the language of imperial secrets better than most. His motivation remains unclear. Some speculate he lost a cousin in the regiment. Others say he was simply unable to tolerate an unanswered question. What is known is this. On the 12th of January, Forsyth requisitioned 3 crates of materials marked Gallipoli, regimental irregularities. These had been placed into a holding depot marked for permanent storage. He signed them out under an alias, L. Ferryman. The name appears nowhere else in military record. The documents revealed more than expected. Several field sketches made by an unnamed officer depicted the fog cloud not as a shapeless mist, but as a structure, cylindrical with a flattened top, its lower edges folding into the grass like liquid fabric. One drawing included concentric lines inside the cloud's outline, annotated "movement inside." Another file contained a letter dated September the 6th, 1915, addressed to Command HQ, Alexandria, Private. It was never sent. Its contents were disturbing. The author, whose signature was obscured by water damage, claimed to have been part of a burial detail dispatched to the ridge 2 weeks after the Sandringham loss. He wrote of strange growths in the soil, bone-white plants with no visible stems, soft to the touch, that oozed a clear sap when crushed. The detail's medical officer warned them not to burn the plants. That night, 2 men reportedly began screaming in their sleep and refused to speak at dawn. Both were discharged, diagnosed with combat hallucinosis. Forsyth, methodical as always, sought verification. He traveled under protection to Athens, where he met with a former Ottoman logistics officer, Idris al-Mahmoud, now retired, living as a merchant among the spice shops of Piraeus. Al-Mahmoud had been stationed less than 1 mile from the ridge during the August engagement. His memory was sharp. He told Forsyth this: 3 days after the disappearance, Ottoman scouts approached the ridge under nightfall. They found not only the bodies of British soldiers, but, briefly, a depression in the ground shaped like an enormous spiral, as though something round and massive had pressed into the soil without digging. The edges were dry, the grass inside dead. The depression was gone the next morning. Wind had not done it. There was no wind. Forsyth pressed him further, but al-Mahmoud refused to speak after that. He returned to his market stall, and Forsyth noted in his report, "I believe he knows more. But whatever it is, he fears it more than he fears me." Back in Alexandria, Forsyth compiled a private memorandum titled Anomalous Terrain Behavior, Suvla Sector. It included a proposal. A survey team equipped with geological instruments and barometric equipment should be sent to the ridge during the spring thaw. He submitted this to his superior, Colonel Ashby. Ashby never responded. Within 1 week, Forsyth was removed from field duty. A clerk found his desk cleared and his notes missing, but a copy of the memorandum survived, sealed inside a folio of unrelated supply requisitions. It was discovered decades later by a historian cataloging irrelevant documents from the First World War. In it, Forsyth describes something chilling. "We must consider, however reluctantly, that what occurred at the ridge on August 21st is not entirely subject to standard military explanation. The fog, if fog it was, defies known patterns of movement and behavior. The failure of instruments, the absence of decay in recovered bodies, the reports of terrain deformation. These are not battlefield anomalies. They suggest a phenomenon of unknown classification. I caution strongly against further deployments to the site until its nature is understood." No further deployments were made. Yet strange reports continued to surface. In April of 1916, a civilian relief group working under the French flag approached the area during an effort to recover personal effects left behind in the withdrawal. A young volunteer nurse, Lucille Davin, was part of that team. She later wrote a letter to her fiancé in Marseille. It was never delivered. The letter remained tucked in a box in her family estate until her death in 1971. In it, she wrote, "Something is wrong with the ground. The air thickens the closer we go to the ridge. It is like breathing through cloth. And always the sensation that we are being watched, not from the hills, but from the earth itself. I saw something last night. A man standing at the edge of the tree line, in British uniform, but not moving, not blinking. When I called, he turned and was gone." Lucille fell ill days later with what was described as a fit of nerves. She returned to France. Her account, like so many others, was dismissed as the effects of exhaustion. But by late summer of that year, British military censors had instituted a quiet protocol. Any future reports involving unusual weather, disappearances, or hallucinatory figures near Anafarta Ridge were to be redirected to a separate office. Not medical, not strategic, simply marked unresolved. In a locked storage room beneath the War Office in London, the file still exists. It contains photographs never published, maps with ink-scratched annotations, and a page torn from a field notebook. The handwriting is shaky, rushed. The page bears only 4 words. It is still there. In early November of 1916, under the cover of diplomatic cargo, a nondescript steamer arrived in the port of Mudros. Officially, the vessel carried medical supplies bound for the newly repurposed infirmaries of Lemnos Island. Unofficially, hidden among crates of quinine and carbolic soap were 6 sealed chests containing barometers, seismographs, photographic equipment, and what one internal memorandum called experimental atmospheric calibration instruments. The men who disembarked with the cargo were not field medics. They wore no insignia, spoke in clipped academic tones, and answered to no divisional command. Their leader was Dr. Harold Vaughan, formerly of the Royal Academy of Natural Sciences, relieved of his lectureship in 1914 after publishing a controversial paper concerning transient geophysical inversions. None of the military personnel on Lemnos knew his true purpose. His orders were sealed, his team restricted to coastal quarters. For 12 days they remained on the island. At dawn on the 13th day, they departed without escort. Their destination? The ridge at Suvla, specifically the northern slope where the Sandringham men had last been observed. Their passage was marked by silence. No records indicate where they made landfall. No logs exist of their rations or movement. But one Turkish shepherd, an old man named Esmet Bayar, would later recall, in a testimony recorded by a British missionary in 1924, 6 Englishmen in brown coats walking single file into the hills. They said nothing, not even to each other. The land went still when they passed. What happened next is known only through fragments. The first is a letter, partially burned, discovered in a misfiled consular bag in Constantinople. Dated December the 3rd, it is addressed to Miss E. Talmadge, Liverpool, and signed only R. The writer claims to have been employed as a technical assistant on a geophysical field team near the Dardanelles. He describes in disjointed language a series of events during their 3rd night on the ridge. There were no stars. The sky blank, like canvas. Then a hum, not from the earth, but above it. The trees near our tent began to twist, not from wind, but as if pulled. Instruments failed. Even the flame in our lamp folded sideways, like iron drawn to a magnet. One of our men, Mallory, stood and walked straight into the trees. Did not return. The next fragment comes from an internal War Office memorandum, classified until 1978, now partially declassified under public records law. It lists an incident logged by a telegraph relay station at Cape Helles. Field signal intercepted, 23:47 local time. Non-standard frequency. Message repeated 3 times. I see them, they do not see me. Signal terminated mid-transmission. No source for the signal was ever located. Then, silence. No return manifests, no end-of-mission report. By January of 1917, the names of Vaughan's team were quietly removed from active personnel roles and listed as missing in field reassignment. Their belongings, including journals, uniforms, and instruments, were returned to their family estates in England. Each parcel arrived with a letter of regret and a stamped notice. Lost at sea during transit. But not all artifacts were lost. In 1931, during renovations at a decommissioned Royal Engineers facility in Portsmouth, a locked metal case was discovered beneath floorboards. Inside were photographs, black and white, faded, depicting terrain consistent with the upper slope of the Suvla Ridge. One photo showed a patch of ground, darkened in a perfect circle, perhaps 40 feet across. In another, a tripod instrument lay on its side, its lens fractured. The most notable image, however, was the last, a man, mid-stride, walking alone toward the ridge. His features were blurred, but behind him, barely visible, was a distortion in the trees, as if a curtain of water, transparent but thick, hung across the forest. The photograph bore a date stamp, November 29th, 1916. No photographer's mark. By the mid-30s, the British military had ceased active investigation into anomalous events related to Gallipoli. Files were either sealed or absorbed into vague bureaucratic codes under natural loss of personnel. Historians speculated. Theories emerged: mass desertion, quicksand, even gas experiments gone awry. But each theory fractured under scrutiny, because even after 2 decades, the reports did not stop. A Turkish archivist, Ferhat Çelik, employed at the Ministry of Antiquities in Ankara, unearthed a series of Ottoman-era field dispatches during a routine cataloging effort. Among them was a small logbook belonging to an artillery observer stationed near Anafarta in the summer of 1915. His entries were meticulous, dry, mechanical, but then, abruptly, one page stood out. It read, "Strange lights on the ridge again. Seen at 4:15. No gunfire, no flares. A shape, very tall, standing in the northern clearing. Unmoving for 20 minutes, then gone. No footsteps, soil still cold." The entry was never followed up. The observer's name was not listed among casualties, but his log ends with that page. The ground, too, began to refuse its secrets. In 1939, a joint excavation by the Turkish and French archaeological commissions attempted to chart ancient burial mounds in the region of Suvla. Work proceeded without incident until they reached the northeast sector. There, over the course of 3 days, 5 workers fell ill. One suffered complete amnesia. Another refused to dig after uncovering a boot still polished. The third collapsed after reportedly hearing a voice in perfect Ottoman Turkish, though no one else heard it. He was later institutionalized in Smyrna. The dig was abandoned. The coordinates were redacted in the final report. Instead, the area was marked culturally unstable and removed from future surveys. As years passed and memory faded, only one fact remained consistent. The ridge had become unnaturally quiet. No birds returned to nest. No nomads grazed nearby. Even wolves, long common in the region, avoided the northern approach. Locals no longer spoke of it. But one letter, handwritten, unsigned, dated July 12, 1946, arrived at the British Embassy in Istanbul. It was delivered by an unknown courier and bore no return address. Written in English, it read, "There is still a light. Sometimes in the late hours, you cannot look directly at it, but if you wait, in the cold, in the silence, you will feel it. Behind you. Waiting." The letter was filed and forgotten, but a notation in the margin added in different ink remains. Begin Phase 2. By the end of 1949, the British Foreign Office had quietly authorized a secondary investigation into the so-called Gallipoli irregularities, though it was never formally acknowledged as such. The directive came not from the military, nor from Parliament, but from the Ministry of Civil Records and National Archives. On the surface, it was a census clarification operation, an effort to resolve discrepancies in service numbers and missing soldier declarations. But the team assigned to the task was composed not of clerks, but of field linguists, geodesists, and one man whose background remains almost entirely redacted, listed only as Dr. Mercer. They arrived in Turkey under diplomatic cover, claiming to be part of a Commonwealth cultural preservation initiative. Their destination, Çanakkale, a town now rebuilt, where the shadows of the war had faded but never entirely lifted. Using old Ottoman maps cross-referenced with British regimental logs, they narrowed the area of interest to a quarter-mile radius, the very slope where the Sandringham Company had last been seen. But before reaching the site, the group made an unexpected stop, a private estate outside the village of Alçatepe, belonging to Professor Levent Duran. Duran was known among European anthropological circles for his controversial work on land memory, the hypothesis that certain geographies possess long-term cognitive imprints of trauma capable of affecting those who pass through them. Though dismissed by his peers, Duran had compiled dozens of post-conflict reports from across Anatolia, cataloging phenomena such as collective silence, migratory collapse, and acute spatial disorientation in survivors. In his records, the Suvla Ridge was marked not with a red circle, but with a black square. When questioned, Duran recounted a story relayed to him by his father, a soldier in the Ottoman Fourth Army. He had not been present at the Sandringham event, but had arrived 2 days later with a supply convoy. What they found, he claimed, was not a battlefield, but a landscape washed of meaning. The equipment left behind had not been looted. Rifles lay clean, uncollected. A tea tin sat, unspilled, still warm to the touch. Yet no tracks, human or animal, led away from the site. The earth had hardened unnaturally, as if scorched from within. One of the British investigators, a young geologist named Sylvia Harker, became obsessed with this claim. She conducted a survey of the soil, sending samples back to London for mineralogical analysis. The results, which remain classified, reportedly showed thermal restructuring inconsistent with surface fire. In simpler terms, the ground had been exposed to intense heat, but without combustion. The crystalline structure of several quartz samples was altered in ways not previously observed outside of controlled laboratory conditions. More disturbing was what Harker found beneath a collapsed section of trench near the ridge's edge. She unearthed the remains of a wooden post, charred at its base. Attached to it, nearly fused into the grain, was a brass tag, the type used for regimental identification. Though partially melted, 3 letters remained legible, San, but the coordinates didn't match the original trench line from 1915. This post had been placed 30 yards further west, in a section of ridge not mapped during the campaign. No official records acknowledged any British presence there. 2 nights after the discovery, Harker vanished from camp. Her tent was found intact, her boots neatly placed by the flap. Her journal, open on the last page, contained only 1 sentence. I heard them marching. A search was mounted at first light. No footprints, no struggle, no sign of departure. Only the distant sound, as one soldier described, like steel tapping on dry stone. The expedition was formally ended 3 days later. Dr. Mercer filed a sealed report and returned to Britain. The contents of that report are unknown. The only surviving indication of its nature is a reference made in a 1952 ministry briefing, buried in footnotes, which described the Suvla anomaly as a non-repeating event bound to terrain-specific causalities. Unresolved, but dormant but not gone. In the winter of 1963, a French ethnographic team, led by Dr. Jean Valois, recorded a local folk tale from shepherds in the nearby hills. The tale spoke of the hollow wind, a soundless draft that swept down from the ridge and froze animals in place. One man recounted how, as a boy, he had seen his father approach the fog that occasionally curled down from the trees. He walked into it, the man said, and never walked back. Curiously, Valois noted that none of the elders in the region would approach the ridge. Even during drought, when pasture was scarce, they avoided that land. She asked why. The answer, written plainly in her notebook, was chilling, because it watches. That same year, a Turkish army mapping survey was conducted along the northern Dardanelles. Aerial photography was used extensively. One image, classified until 1994, shows what appears to be a circular depression near the ridge, precisely at the location of the Sandringham disappearance. The depression measures 43 feet in diameter. No official explanation was given. Satellite reanalysis decades later revealed minor electromagnetic disturbances within that radius. Attempts to photograph the site from ground level often failed. Cameras jammed, lenses cracked, film exposed with no light source. 3 photographers reported nausea and severe disorientation. One, a civilian contractor, suffered a seizure minutes after stepping into the zone. He survived, but remained unresponsive for 6 days. Upon waking, he repeated a single phrase in English, though he had never spoken the language. They're still listening. Following the incident, the Turkish Ministry of Forestry placed the area under restricted status. The stated reason? Unstable geology. But no seismic activity has ever been recorded there by the late 1970s. Gallipoli had become a site of selective remembrance, a place of tours and monuments, of diplomatic handshakes and filtered grief. The ridge where the Sandringham Company vanished was not marked by any plaque. There is no cross, no flag, no carved stone, only grass and a silence that deepened with each decade, but not all forgot. In 1982, a retired RAF technician named Gerald Lasky began compiling documents on the disappearance. His uncle, Corporal James Lasky, had been with the company. Gerald's notes, precise, heavily annotated, drew connections between barometric anomalies, soil composition, and first-hand testimonies from both sides. He called it the Gallipoli pattern. His last recorded entry, written weeks before his death from a stroke in 1985, reads, "It's not a question of where they went. The question is, what opened?" The question remains unanswered. And somewhere in that northern ridge, untouched by time or war, the grass still bends inward, as if pressed by unseen boots marching in silence. In the autumn of 1998, nearly a century after the disappearance of the Norfolk men, the ridge near Suvla became the subject of one final, unofficial expedition. No governmental seal endorsed it. There were no War Office approvals, no archival departments involved. This journey began with a voice. Miriam Albridge, a sound engineer working on oral history preservation for the BBC, had been reviewing old recordings for a documentary on Great War veterans. Among the reels was an unlabeled acetate disc, damaged but partially intact. The voice on the recording, elderly, deliberate, breathless, spoke in a Norfolk accent. The label on the cardboard sleeve was faded, but under the right light, 2 words were visible. Captain Godley. That name had been scrubbed from all surviving rosters. The man on the recording described, in halting terms, what he believed had happened to his regiment. Not in detail, but in fragments. There was mention of light without flame, a weight in the chest, the sound of rain, though the air was dry, and most vividly, the sensation of turning sideways without moving. What made the recording remarkable was its date, April 1967. That year, there were no known surviving officers of the original Norfolk unit. Albridge brought the tape to a private historian, Dr. Elliot Keswick, who had written extensively on military disappearances. Keswick, skeptical at first, began cross-referencing the voice's description with other unverified testimonies. The cadence, vocabulary, and phrasing aligned almost perfectly with letters written by Captain Rupert Godley in 1914. More intriguing was the mention of a black banner appearing in the trees, a phrase that also occurred in the Turkish field log recovered in 1931. No one else had known that term. Keswick organized a team of 5. No sponsors, no government oversight. They traveled to Gallipoli in October of that year, posing as civilian researchers studying post-war erosion patterns. The local authorities, by then familiar with odd foreign inquiries, granted minimal access with a 24-hour limit. They were told to stay on the lower trails. They did not. They reached the ridge at dusk. A wind had picked up, dry and electric, crackling through the shrubs. The slope was unremarkable at first. Grass thinned by time, the skeleton of a trench barely visible. But as night fell, they noticed the stillness. No insects, no birds, no distant animal cries. Only a hum, faint but persistent, as if vibrating through the soil. Keswick's assistant, a young cartographer named John Harris, reported seeing a shimmer in the dark, like heat off tarmac. They approached it cautiously. He placed a geolocation beacon on the edge of the ridge and took several photos with a 35mm camera. The shutter snapped, but the film would later develop blank. At 02:37, the beacon signal cut out. Their radios began to emit static. Not white noise, but something rhythmic. A low pulse, almost like breath. One of the team, a linguist named Sadaf Reza, began repeating a single phrase in Turkish. "Buraya 8 değilsiniz." You do not belong here. She had no memory of doing so. They departed at dawn, shaken but physically unharmed. The only physical remnant of the expedition was a notebook left behind by Keswick. It contained rough sketches, soil readings, and one final entry. I believe the event was not a disappearance. It was an edit, something overwritten. The men are not gone, they are unreachable. After returning to London, Keswick declined further interviews. 6 months later, he was found dead in his home, cause listed as cardiac arrest in sleep. His death, while sudden, raised no official suspicions. But the note found beside his bed, written in his own hand, had read, "Marching, every night now, from the walls, through the floor. They do not know they're gone." In the years that followed, scattered reports continued. A hiker from New Zealand vanished while tracing wartime paths. A Turkish forestry survey recorded unexplained signal interference near the Suvla sector. One local boy claimed to have seen a man in brown digging with no shovel. He described the figure's face as soft, like smoke. No bodies, no prints, no cause. Then, silence again. In 2019, during satellite terrain analysis for unrelated development, a data technician noticed a curious aberration in the northern Suvla topography. For precisely 7 seconds, a series of tightly nested lines appeared in the terrain contour, perfectly concentric, uncharacteristic of natural formations. They vanished from the next scan. The location matched exactly the last known coordinates of the Sandringham Company. The technician filed an internal anomaly report, which was promptly archived. The file was marked with a single tag, Legacy. There has never been an official recognition of what happened at Gallipoli in August of 1915. No monument bears their names, no list includes their fate. For the families, there were only telegrams, missing in action, presumed dead. But some say that in the quiet hours before sunrise, on the upper slopes of Suvla, if you stand very still and let your eyes adjust to the dark, you might see a line of figures moving through the brush. No sound, no breath, no heat, marching endlessly, forward, but never home.